You may have realized that all my shorts this past week have been about the cons faction. I did my best to tell their stories in the limited time that I had, but 60 seconds over 4 days doesn't quite do the full con story justice. Today we're going to take a look at the roaming raider tribe that has been beaten down more than once, but, one way or another, has always managed to get back up. Let's explore the lore surrounding the cons faction. Now, you can't truly tell the story of the cons without telling the story of one West Coast vault. Vault 15, like many of the nation's vaults, had a social experiment tied to it. What would happen if each vault dweller had one of 4 radically diverse ideologies and cultures? And while the specifics of what happened in the vault are unknown, once that big vault door opened in 2141, the dwellers formed up into 5 groups and went on their way. These groups were 1. The people who would go on to found Shady Sands and eventually the NCR, 2. Those who wished to stay in the opened and now gutted vault, 3. The savage and cannibalistic jackals, 4. The snake-worshipping vipers, and lastly 5. The topic of today, the meanest and toughest SOBs around, the cons. Adopting a warrior lifestyle, the cons would roam around New California, raiding and pillaging settlements and towns. They were fearless combatants who worshipped strength above all else. As such, they would frequently pick fights with other raider groups. One such skirmish had the cons facing off with their former bunkmates, the jackals. The cons won and nearly wiped out the cannibalistic tribe. As a result, the jackals would be forced to flee southern New California, relinquishing the territory to the cons. By 2161, the cons' governing warband was being led by a ruthless warlord named Garl Deathhand, after he had murdered his own father for the position. Under Garl, the cons were an everlasting presence in the New California Wasteland, regularly raiding smaller communities while peacefully trading with larger ones. However, Garl had a tendency to bite off more than he could chew. This fatal flaw would unknowingly be the downfall of not only his warband, but the cons as a faction. Sometime in 2161, the cons initiated a plot to kidnap the daughter of Shady Sands' founder. Concerned about his daughter's safety, Aradesh employed the services of the Vault Dweller to track down those responsible. This led the Vault Dweller to the cons' base, just south of Shady Sands. Unwilling to negotiate with the raiders, the Vault Dweller would massacre the tribe, saving Tandy, Aradesh's daughter, in the process. And this event would mark the death of the cons. Although many smaller warbands still existed dotted throughout the West Coast, their governing and greatest warband was now massacred. A once great, bloodthirsty roaming band of warriors was reduced to nothing by a lone hero. But one survivor remained. Darian, the son of Garl, managed to flee the scene unharmed. Suffering from immense survivor's guilt for not dying alongside the rest of his tribe, Darian would vow to get revenge on Tandy and the NCR. However, this would take time. As much of his true con brethren had perished in the slaughter, Darian had to supplement his forces with paid mercenaries. His new tribe were now the new cons. And although they weren't as dominant as the cons of old, Darian still managed to keep his tribe going. The tribe settled inside the ruins of Vault 15, using the squatters' tents and huts as cover from the NCR. Darian would make a deal with the squatters. In exchange for returning the vault to full functionality, the squatters would do their best to deter all NCR attempts to retake the vault. In addition to this, Darian and his group would attack NCR caravans for food and water. And also, somehow Darian managed to plant a spy into the NCR's Hall of Congress. Seriously, I'm not sure how he managed to do that. By all appearances, the group is still struggling. Their base is a rundown vault that was already occupied, and they had to raid caravans for supplies while the cons of old would raid entire settlements. How on earth did they get a spy into the NCR government? That's some Kaiser's Legion level stuff. Anywho. But like their former tribe was wiped out by the Vault Dweller, the new cons would meet their demise at the hands of his descendant, the Chosen One. But this time, it was more of a coincidence. You see, Tandy and the NCR needed some pre-war computer parts from Vault 15, but the squatters that had set up shop there denied the NCR access to the vault and refused to elaborate further. And eventually, the NCR representatives that were sent to negotiate with the squatters stopped returning altogether. Thusly so, Tandy employed the aid of the Chosen One to retrieve the needed computer parts, and to also try and negotiate the terms for Vault 15 to join the NCR. So, the Chosen One made contact with the squatters, discovered that they were having problems with their new neighbors, the Raiders, and made a deal with them. The Chosen One would deal with Darien and his goons if the squatters would join the Republic. And since working with the NCR instead of working with raiders sounded better, it was a no-brainer decision. And in mighty protagonist fashion, the Chosen One would not only put an end to the Death Hand family lineage, but also finally extinguish the last of the Khan's fiercest warband. But once again, the Khans were not quite dead yet. While their governing warband was truly eliminated this time, several smaller warbands still existed, scattered throughout California. It would take 25 years before the scattered warbands would decide to unite into a singular, united faction, and under the leadership of the one that goes by Papa Khan, the final iteration of Khans, the Great Khans, were born. But despite California being their old stomping grounds, the rapid growth of the NCR forced them to move east into the Mojave. In 2267, the Great Khans were mentored by a group of followers of the Apocalypse. The followers taught the Khans chemistry and how to read and write. They had hope that the Khans would use this newfound knowledge to manufacture and trade their own medicine, but the Khans had other ideas. Using their new chemistry skills, the Great Khans would go on about creating their own chem empire, selling to the Fiends and West Side. This newly acquired knowledge, paired with their fierce combat skills, made the Great Khans the most organized faction in the Mojave at the time. Similar to how the Khans dominated New California, the Great Khans were now dominating New Vegas. But, as with all of the Khans' stories, it wouldn't last forever. You see, Mr. House was plotting ways to make New Vegas his, and when he heard word of NCR scouts checking out the Hoover Dam in 2274, he decided it was his time to cut out a piece of the Mojave Wasteland before the NCR could get the chance to do as they please. So, House struck a deal with several smaller tribes of the Mojave. He made a deal with the Boot Riders, who would become the chairman, an unnamed cannibal tribe, who became the White Glove Society, and the Slitherkin, who became the Omertas. In exchange for warring with the Great Khans and exerting control over New Vegas, House would provide the tribes with medicine, weapons, ammo, and a spot in his Vegas empire. The Great Khans, despite controlling the Mojave for the last 7 years, stood no match for the 3 united and well-funded families. The Great Khans were forced to leave the New Vegas area, and instead they settled at Bitter Springs. Having lost their status at the top of the food chain, the Great Khans would instead resort to fighting with their oldest adversaries and former bunkmates, the NCR. As the Republic was still fresh meat in the wastes of the Mojave, their caravans, towns, and camps were easy pickings for the Great Khans. However, as time went on and more of the NCR's resources went into the Mojave campaign, the Great Khans went from being massive thorns in the Republic's sides to the least of their worries. 2 other major players emerged in the Mojave, a heavily armored militant group obsessed with technology, the Brotherhood of Steel, and a ruthless Roman Empire-inspired tribe, Kaiser's Legion. The Brotherhood of Steel was holed up in an old solar farm named Helios 1. As the site could generate and provide power to much of the region, taking Helios 1 from the Brotherhood of Steel was a high priority for the Republic. And so, after 2 years of guerrilla fighting, the NCR would initiate Operation Sunburst. The operation proved so successful that it severely crippled the Mojave Brotherhood of Steel chapter and caused much internal conflict as well. The Brotherhood were off the stage that is the Mojave Theater. Now, as for Kaiser's Legion, the tribe over the years managed to assimilate many smaller tribes that settled east of the Colorado River. As the force pushed west, Legion scouts discovered the Hoover Dam. Believing the Colorado River could be his version of the Rubicon River, Kaiser believed that controlling the dam was his first step to controlling Rome, also known as New Vegas. Facing a weakened NCR due to their conflicts with the Brotherhood of Steel and their loss of supply lines due to a nuclear explosion in Hopeville and Ashton, the Legion made their move. The leader of the operation, Malpais Leggett, decided that a direct attack would be optimal, with new recruits in the front and veterans behind, giving orders. This worked well until Ranger Chief Hanlon managed to bait the veteran legionaries into a trap at Boulder City, guaranteeing an NCR victory. With this loss, Kaiser set his military leader alight and dumped him into the Grand Canyon. The Legion would be forced to bide their time and set up camp on the other side of the Colorado River at Fortification Hill. With 2 major factions dealt with, the New California Republic could change their focus to the Great Khans. It would seem that after over 137 years of fighting, the 2 factions that started as Vault 15 dwellers would come to a final confrontation. However, what no one knew at the time was that this, the Bitter Springs Massacre that is, would be a massive dark spot on the history of the NCR, and also, unsurprisingly, not be the end of the Great Khans. In 2278, 3 years before the start of New Vegas, the NCR, going off of faulty intel, believed that the Great Khan settlement of Bitter Springs was in fact a military stronghold. As such, their planned military assault of the encampment was one of the largest since the First Battle of Hoover Dam against the Legion, making use of all the available soldiers and resources at Camp Gulf. The operation would go as follows. A primary shock force would engage the combatants in the camp, while a group of 1st Recon sharpshooters would post up on Coyote Tail Ridge with orders to shoot anyone leaving the canyon, as to ensure the primary force wasn't susceptible to flanks. However, as the settlement was in fact not a military stronghold, the NCR's plans went belly up almost immediately. From the Great Khan's perspective, they saw a sizable and hostile force coming their way, so the fighters of the tribe engaged with the Republic's troops, buying time for the women, children, and wounded to escape. Unbeknownst to them, however, waiting outside a small escape path from the canyon was a squad of NCR sharpshooters. When the sharpshooters saw that it wasn't combatants coming out of the canyon, but civilians, the troops hesitated to shoot and passed their concerns up the chain of command. In response, and perhaps due to some confusion in the communications, they were told to fire until they ran out of ammunition. When the unnamed major in charge of the operation realized that it was women and children being killed, they froze from shock. The major's second-in-command, Daughtry, who was a captain at the time, took control of the situation. Captain Daughtry ordered a ceasefire and for his soldiers to begin administering first aid to the wounded, NCR and Great Khan alike. The dead were buried in the canyon, and the cemetery was made into a sort of memorial for the tragic event. In a show to make amends with the devastated tribe, the NCR would permit the Great Khans to relocate to Red Rock Canyon and live their lives without any NCR interference. Bitter Springs itself was cleaned up and converted into a refugee camp for anyone trying to escape the Legion's expansion efforts. Regardless of what measures the NCR took to try and right their wrong, nothing could ever bring back the innocent lives that were lost that day. From that day on, a permanent shadow was cast over the Great Khan's relations with the NCR. As such, many Khans rightfully held grudges and vowed for revenge against the Republic. Oscar Velasco was one such Khan. Hiding out in a cave near Bitter Springs, Velasco would commence a 3-year, one-man guerrilla warfare campaign against the NCR and those at the refugee camp. Chance was another Great Khan that was greatly affected by the Bitter Springs massacre. The PTSD he acquired from the horrific event turned the Great Khan mute. When he, alongside McMurphy and Jessup, were hired by former enemy and boot rider Benny, Chance would reluctantly come along for the job. Despite the massacre happening 3 years ago, it would seem that graphic images of the event are all that Chance dreams about, whether he's asleep, in a chem-addled haze, or even fully conscious. The screams from his dying loved ones plagues his thoughts, so much so that when he saw a group of fiends raiding a tribal village, something inside of him snapped. Reminded of his own tribe's agony and pain, Chance would go into a crazed state, doing to the fiends what he wasn't able to do to the NCR. Stop them. Chance would continuously fight throughout the night until every fiend lay dead. By the time the dust settled, Chance laid on the ground, severely wounded from battle. Benny, recognizing that Chance was going through something similar to one of Benny's own tribesmen, offered the scarred Great Khan a final vial of spiked psycho. Chance, wanting to be with the ones that died at Bitter Springs, downed the lethal chem, finally reaching a form of peace. Despite the horrors of Bitter Springs, the Great Khans, like many times before, persevered. The faction wouldn't die out that easily. Now, at Red Rock Canyon and out of reach of the NCR, the Great Khans would resume their chem production as a means to provide for the clan, once again selling to the fiends and villages of West New Vegas. The Great Khans had to rely much more on chem running as Red Rock Canyon was nigh inhabitable. No workable land, hardly any water, and honestly, nothing that anybody could ever want. Despite their trade being detrimental to the NCR, through the fiends being fueled by the Khans' chems, the NCR dared not enter Red Rock Canyon, partly due to the high resource cost for initiating an assault, and partly due to their sour reputation with the faction due to the Bitter Springs massacre. Not only were chems the primary source of their income, but they were also at the center of their society. Using alcohol and chems as a coping mechanism became extremely common in Great Khan culture. Years of being beaten down by the NCR, being forced to constantly move settlements, and losing countless loved ones caused many Great Khans to find outlets for their emotions. Papa Khan, the leader of the Great Khans since their inception, was pained seeing his once great tribe turned into nothing but glorified chem runners in leather. He wanted to go back to the roaming warriors of old. So when Frumentarius Karl found the Great Khans and told them that Kaiser's legion would provide land, wealth, and revenge against the NCR in exchange for their support, it was no wonder Papa Khan almost immediately agreed. Kaiser's proposal would solve all the Great Khan's problems. New habitable land that would replace Red Rock, unimaginable wealth so that they didn't need to chem run anymore, revenge against a faction that has been bothering them for over a century, and, most importantly to Papa Khan, a chance to once again flex their military might. And so, Papa Khan and the Great Khans decided to march alongside Kaiser whenever the time would come. But the true reality of Kaiser's plans is far from what was promised. And this leads us to the multiple endings of New Vegas. As an aside, there are multiple endings for the Khans and New Khans in Fallout 1 and 2 respectively, but the release of Fallout 2 canonized the death of the Khans, and the release of New Vegas canonized the death of the New Khans. So until a New Vegas 2, consider each of these endings as possible outcomes for the Great Khans. Without any courier interference and the Legion winning the dam, the Great Khans are forcibly assimilated into the Legion's ranks. The Great Khans, a once progressive faction, has their warrior women sold off as wives to the officers of the Legion. Any sick or elderly are bluntly executed, and any remaining identity of the Khans is wiped. No more leather, no more yurts, no more warrior culture. All that Kaiser promised was for naught. Without courier intervention and the NCR wins the dam, the Great Khans become the first target of the NCR. The Great Khans that survived the Second Battle of the Hoover Dam retreat to the wilderness of Idaho. If the courier kills Papa Khan and his advisor Regis, then the remaining Great Khans retreat to Idaho, ready to rebuild their faction once again. If the courier convinces Papa Khan to break his alliance with the Legion, replaces Papa Khan with Regis, and the NCR wins the dam, then the Great Khans return to living at Red Rock Canyon. Things were swell for some time until the NCR once again came a-knocking. Breaking their agreed-upon amnesty, the remaining Great Khans were relocated to an isolated and barren reservation away from the northern NCR trade routes. I'd imagine that without NCR aid, the Great Khans would die out from this point. Although a barren reservation isn't much different from Red Rock Canyon, at least at Red Rock, the Great Khans can make a living by selling chems to villages. Being away from trade routes complicates their economy quite a bit. If the courier convinces Papa Khan to break his alliance with the Legion, but the Legion wins the dam, then as punishment for supporting the NCR, the Legion hastily hunts down the Great Khans, doing what the Vault Dweller, Chosen One, and NCR could not by finally defeating the Great Khans. Kaiser would go on to ensure their names be wiped from history and their legacy be forgotten. If the courier convinces Papa Khan that the Great Khans have no true legacy, many Khans make a final stand alongside the Legion at the dam. Regardless of which side wins the battle, any remaining Great Khans disperse, joining up with other gangs and tribes across the Mojave. Again, the Great Khans are forgotten. And the last and truly best ending for the Great Khans is if the courier convinces Papa Khan to break his alliance with the Legion, Papa Khan remains as the Great Khan leader, and he's convinced that the Great Khans should claim their own legacy. In this scenario, during the Second Battle of the Hoover Dam, Khans, instead of picking a side, will instead evacuate Red Rock Canyon and head north into the plains of Wyoming. There, the group reconnects with their old pals, the Followers of the Apocalypse. With the Followers' help, the Great Khans go on to rebuild their once glorious tribe. After learning the power of ancient government, economics, and transportation, the Great Khans would go on to form their mighty empire out of the ruins of the Northwest. Finally, the Great Khans are restored to more than their former selves. Years of being beaten down and tossed about are no more. The Great Khans finally get the chance to live up to their names and emulate the Mongol empires of old in which they take their namesake. But that is only one of 7 endings for the Great Khans, of which 4 of the 7 either see the Great Khans entirely wiped out, severely crippled to a point beyond repair, or their culture and identity completely annihilated. The Khans are one of the oldest factions in the Fallout series, having made their first appearance back in 1997 with the release of the first Fallout. What was once a fearsome band of roaming raiders is turned into a bunch of chem dealers who wear a lot of leather. A group that has constantly been chewed up, swallowed, and spit back up by the Wasteland. A punching bag for the NCR, the Legion, Mr. House and the Three Families, and all the protagonists of the games. And yet, despite their many scars and bruises, somehow they keep getting back up. For a tribe that no one likes, they sure are damn hard to kill. And this wraps up the story of the Khans. If you have any other factions you'd like to see me do this sort of deep dive storytelling for, let me know. Thanks for commenting and sharing. Have a good rest of your day. Cheers.
Nah, man, more like drug suppliers.